All right, we're doing 11.6 now. We're talking about the Pythagorean theorem. Hopefully you guys remember this from junior high, but if not, let's just really quickly review some things about the Pythagorean theorem. Number one, it only works with right triangles. So remember, a right triangle is a triangle with a right angle. A right angle is an angle of 90 degrees. Normally that will be shown by a little box in one of the corners. That will show that it's a right triangle. If it's not a right triangle, this does not work. So this only works with right triangles. Secondly, first of all, let me just state it here. It's a squared plus b squared equals c squared. What that means is if I have a right triangle, a and b are always going to be my legs, which are always the two smaller sides. Those are the sides that are next to the right angle. The last one, c, is always going to be my hypotenuse. That's always going to be my longest side. And it's always going to be the one that's across from the right angle. Finally, when you find your answer, this is going to be the lengths of the sides, so it's always going to be positive. Now, remember the last lesson we talked about if I have x squared equals 16, the answer could be plus or minus 4. But since this is a triangle and we're finding sides, we're always going to only use the plus since we're talking about a length, and lengths cannot be negative. So, to solve, if I want to solve for the hypotenuse, so if it gives me the two smaller sides and I want the longest side, the hypotenuse, I simply square each leg, I add them together, and then I find the square root of the answer. So let's say, for example, they were to give me a right triangle, and in this right triangle, the two legs are 10 and 20, and it wants this side. I know this is the hypotenuse. This is the side across from the right angle. It's the longest side. So I take my two legs and I square them. 10 squared is 100. 20 squared is 400. I add those together. That is not my answer. After you add those together, make sure you do the square root. If it doesn't have a square root, make sure you simplify. So I'm not going to do the simplification. Hopefully you know how to do that by now. That's 10 square root of 5. That would be my answer. What about if I'm looking for a leg? In this example up here, I have the hypotenuse and I have one leg and I want the other leg. Well, I'm going to square both of these. So 12 squared is 144. 15 squared is 225. And then I'm going to do the hypotenuse squared minus the leg squared. So I'm going to do the hypotenuse squared minus the leg squared. That's going to give me 81. And then again, that's not your answer. Your last step is always to find the square root. 81 does have a square root, so my last one is 9. Make sure it makes sense. The two legs should always be smaller than the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse should always be the longest leg. That should be reviewed, so hopefully you remember how to do that. That's how you use the Pythagorean theorem. Now there's two more things we're going to go over in this lesson. Number one is what we call the distance formula. If they give you 2 points on a graph, so for example, if they give you the points -3, 1, and then the point 5, 4, and they want you to find the distance between those 2 points, I can use the Pythagorean theorem to find this. But first, I want the distance between these two. First, I'm going to make a right triangle. So I'm going to draw a line straight across from this point to the bottom of this, and then straight up. I know the distance from here to here is just going to be the distance between 5 and -3. So I just subtract 5 minus -3. That's not 2. 2 negatives make a positive. That's going to be 8. And then 4 minus 1 is 3. Now I have my two legs, so I can add them together, square them both. 9 plus 3 squared plus 8 squared is 64. 9 plus 64 is 73. And then, remember, last step is the square root, so it's a square root of 73 is my answer. And then I can simplify that if possible. Now, I can use something called the distance formula that makes that whole thing much easier. So the distance formula is simply the square root of x squared minus x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So all this is saying is I subtract my two x's, I square the answer. I subtract my two y's, I square the answer. I add the two answers, and I find the square root. So if I have 2, 1, and 5, 1, doesn't matter which order, I can do 2 minus 5, 5 minus 2, When I square it, it's going to become positive either way. 5 minus 2 is 3, squared is 9. 1 minus 1 is 0, squared is 0. 9 plus 0 is 9, but don't forget that last step. When you square, add, you have to do the square root of your answer. So my distance between those two would be 3. That's how you would use the distance formula. You can use that for any numbers. Just subtract your x's, subtract your y's, square them both, add them together, and then find the square root. Sometimes it wants the midpoint. The midpoint is the line halfway, the point halfway between 2 points. That's just the average, so all I have to do is add my 2 points together, divide by 2. So if I want the x, I add my two x's together, negative 3 and 5. That gives me 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. I add my two y's together. 1 plus 4 is 5. 5 divided by 2 is 2.5. That's my y. So when it asks for the midpoints, you're always going to write it as an x and a y. So I have 1 and 2.5. So you just add your x's together, divide by 2. That will give you the x that's the midpoint. Add your y's together, divide by 2. That will give you the y that's the midpoint. So when it asks for the midpoint, you should always give a point. It's going to be halfway between those 2 points, which is going to be your x, 2x's divided by 2, and then your y, 2 y's divided by 2. So your midpoint should always look like this. Now, one more thing before I finish up here. Sometimes it'll give you 3 numbers and it'll ask you if these are the 3 sides of a triangle, is the triangle a right triangle? Well, we know if the triangle is a right triangle, it has to have the Pythagorean theorem true. So we call this the converse of the Pythagorean theorem. All it means if I have the 2 smaller squared and it equals the longest squared, it is. So if I square the 2 smaller ones, add them together, it should equal the biggest one squared. If it doesn't, it's not a right triangle. You would write no. If it does work, it is a right triangle, you'd write yes. So for example, if it gives you the 3 numbers 4, 6, and 8, I square the 2 smaller numbers, add them together, and that should equal the bigger number squared. Does 16 plus 36 equal 64? No. So my answer, if it gave me this and asked if it was a right triangle, I would say no. How about this? 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16. Does that equal 25? Yes. So this is a right triangle. So that would be a right triangle. Finally, let me just show you one more with the midpoint formula. This looks more confusing, but it's not. Again, I'm going to ask if I want my midpoint, I'm going to add my x's. Since these are like terms, I get 6 square root of 2, then divide by 2. So I can reduce my 6 and my 2, so I get 3 square root of 2. That's my x. And then these are like terms, so I can add. That's going to give me negative 4 square root of 5. Again, I divide by 2. I can reduce that, so I get negative 2 square root of 5. So that would be my midpoint. And that's the lesson.